Welcome back to our channel, guys. Today we are gonna discuss about our assignment, Ignou assignment, MEG01, Literary Criticism and Theory. Let's have an overlook of the assignment. This assignment is of 100 marks. It consists of 6 questions, and out of 6 questions we have to attempt 5 questions, and each carry 20 marks. Now we will come to question number 1. Explain any two of the excerpts of the poem given below with reference to their context. ये आपको एक पोएम का एक पैसेज दे रखा है और हमें इसे एक्सप्लेन करना है. फॉर द आंसर फॉर दिस इज John Milton's To Penseroso is a lyric poem centering on melancholy as a stimulus for sober contemplation and inspired writing. The title is an Italian word meaning the pensive man. The poem was published in London in 1645 as part of collections. The poem of John Milton, both English and Latin. It is a companion piece to El Allegro, a lyric poem that quotes joy rather than melancholy. The poems use similar metric and rhyme schemes. So there are two authors. इन दोनों ऑथर का राइटिंग स्टाइल काफ़ी ज़्यादा सिमिलर था, बस एक सैडनेस को रिप्रेजेंट करता है और दूसरे जॉय को. ये दो पर्सपेक्टिव्स बताते हैं. एज यू कैन सी इट्स रिटन हियर इन सेकेंड लाइन. दीज टू पोएम्स ऑफर टू डिफरेंट पर्सपेक्टिव ऑन वेदर इट इज़ बेटर टू लिव अ केयर फ्री और अ कॉन्टम्पलेटेड लाइफ. तो ये दो पर्सपेक्टिव बताते हैं. एक ऑथर बोलता है, एक पोएट बोलता है कि हमें केयर फ्री होकर जीना चाहिए, और दूसरा बोलता है कि हमें थोड़ा सीरियसनेस लानी चाहिए लाइफ में. या El Allegro, or the Joyful Man in Italian, argues for living a pleasurable life, while the narrator in Penseroso, or the Pensive Man, argues for a life dedicated to study. Both the poem begin with their respective narrators invoking a goddess to be their guide. In doing so, the poems reflect the Western classical tradition of praising a chosen god or goddess. Penseroso dedicates the first 10 lines of his argument to banishing wind-deluding joys, the themes that guide Allegro from his poem. The speaker in El Allegro begins his own argument in a similar way by banishing melancholy, the goddess that guides El Allegro from his poem. Though each speaker is arguing against the other, the shared structure gestures to what the two poems have in common. Both begin with 10-line introduction in which the speaker rejects the other speaker's guide. Even as the speakers insist that they share nothing, their arguments formally echo and reflect each other. In the poem's first line, Milton is already subverting his speaker's arguments against each other by drawing attention to what they share. After choosing melancholy as his guide, the speaker goes on to give an account of how she was conceived by Vesta and Saturn. Vesta was a Greek goddess famous for her virginity, and the speaker describes how she conceived melancholy through an incestuous affair with her father. The story is Milton's own invention and an oddly profane note in a poem about the life of contemplation. The speaker goes on to call for melancholy companion, peace, quiet, fast leisure contemplation, and silence to join. He then describes walking through the forest at night, listening for different sounds, and imagine how he might spend an evening in a solitary cottage or a lonely tower. The speaker's thought moved from philosophy to tragedy as he imagines the fall of ancient cities, the modern plays performed in theatres. He alludes to the story of Orpheus, a shepherd from classical mythology famous for trying to rescue his wife from the underworld. He then turns to the story of Canas, a character from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales who receives a ring that allows her to translate the songs of birds and uses it to hear the tragic love story of a hawk. Morning comes and the speaker asks melancholy to lead him to a shadowed part of the woods where he can dream. He wakes to music and imagines following the sound to a church where an organ is playing. Finally, he imagines retiring to a hermitage to study and repeats that he wants to live his life with melancholy. Many scholars think that Milton favored the argument in Penseroso over the one made in El Allegro. Some have suggested that Allegro and Penseroso are about forming a coherent self, and that the poems chart the course of one speaker's life from bounding youth to a more tempered age. Louis March has pointed out that the speaker in El Allegro barely has a self. The words I and me only appear 4 times, while the speaker in Penseroso returns to his place in the world again and again, using the words I and me 11 times. Marx argues that the poem is about growth, not argument, and many others have suggested that Milton builds from El Allegro to Penseroso. Now we have second para. Yeah, second question, and we have given 4 lines, and we have to explain the poem. The following lines taken from Epithalamion. Epithalamion is an ode written by Edmund Spenser to his bride, Elizabeth Boyle, on their wedding day in 1594. It was first published in 1595 in London by William Ponsonby as part of a volume entitled Amority and Epithalamium, written not since by Edmund Spenser. The volume included a sequence of 89 sonnets along with a series of short poems called Anacreontics and Epithalamium, a public poetic celebration of marriage. Epithalamium is an ode written by Edmund Spenser as a gift to his bride, Elizabeth Boyle, on the wedding day. The poem moves through the couple's wedding day from the groom's impatient hours before dawn to the late hours of night after the husband and wife have consummated their marriage. Spenser is very methodical in his depiction of time as it passes, both in the accurate chronological sense and in the subjective sense of time as felt by those waiting in anticipation or fear. So, this poem was first published in 1595 in London, and here the poet Edmund Spenser has written this poem as a gift to his bride. और पोएम जो है कपल्स के लिए है, लाइक कपल्स की वेडिंग डे के अराउंड घूमती रहती है, सुबह से लेकर रात तक जो वेडिंग डे में होता है कपल्स, एक ब्राइड और ग्रूम की जो सिचुएशन होती है, जो ग्रूम इम्पेशेंट आवर्स और लेट आवर्स नाइट तक लाइक शादी चलती है वेडिंग डे, तो उसके बारे में पोएट ने इस पोएम में बताया. As with most classically inspired works, this ode begins with an invocation to the muses to help the groom. However, in this case, they are to help him awaken his bride, not create his poetic work. Then follows a growing procession of figures who attempt to bestir the bride from her bed. Once the sun has risen, the bride finally awakens and begins her procession to the bridal bower. She comes to the temple and is wed. Then a celebration ensues. Almost immediately, the groom wants everyone to leave and the day to shorten so that he may enjoy the bliss of his wedding night. Once the night arrives, however, the groom turns his thought toward the product of their union, praying to various gods that his new wife's womb might be fertile and give him multiple children. The bride has finally awoken, and her eyes have been compared to the sun with their goodly beams, more bright than Hesperus. The groom invites the daughters of delight to attend to the bride, but also the hours of the day and night, the seasons, and the three handmaids of Venus. He encourages the latter to do for his wife what they do for Venus, sing to her as she dresses for her wedding. The mythical characters of Rosy Dawn, Tithons, and Phoebus are invoked here to continue the ode's classical theme. So far, its content is indistinguishable from that of a pagan wedding hymn. The fact that the groom must address his bride directly illustrates both his impatience and the ineffectiveness of relying on the muses and nymphs to fetch the bride. There is second daybreak here when the darksome cloud is lifted from the bride's face and her eyes are free to shine in all their splendor. The daughters of delight are the nymphs who are still exhorted to attend on the wedding, but Spenser introduces the personifications of time in the hours that make up day, night, and the seasons. He will return to this time motif later, but it is crucial to note here he views time itself participating in the marriage ritual as much as the nymphs and handmaids of Venus. So that was the second part of the first question. Now we have second question. Draw a comparison between epithalamium and prothalamium as wedding songs. Answer with suitable examples. The main difference between epithalamium and prothalamium is, is that epithalamium is a poem that elaborates on marriage celebration. On the other hand, prothalamium is a poem or a song used for celebrating a forthcoming wedding. Epithalamium focuses less on the personal approach era, whereas prothalamium focuses more on the personal approach side. जो हमारा एपिथेलेमियम है वो मैरिज सेलिब्रेशन को इलेबोरेट करता है, बट प्रोथैलेमियम हमारा एक प्रोथैलेमियम पोएम जो होती है वो फोर्थ कमिंग वेडिंग जो अपकमिंग वेडिंग है उसकी सेलिब्रेशन को सेलिब्रेट करता है. एपिथेलियम हमारा पर्सनल लाइफ पे ज़्यादा फोकस नहीं करता है, बट प्रोथैलेमियम हमारी पर्सनल अप्रोच पे ज़्यादा फोकस करता है. Epithalamium is an ode written to commemorate the nuptials of the speaker and his bride. The song begins before dawn and progresses through the wedding ceremony and into the consummation night of the newlywed couple. Throughout Epithalamium, the speakers mark time by referencing the physical movements of the wedding party, the positions of the sun and other celestial bodies, and the light and the darkness that fill the day. Although firmly within the classical tradition, Epithalamium takes its settings and several of its images from Ireland, where Edmund Spenser's wedding to Elizabeth Boyle actually took place. Some critics have seen in this Irish connection a commentary within the poem of the proper relationship between ruling England, the groom, and subject Ireland, the bride. Spenser's love for the Irish countryside is clear through his vivid description of natural world surroundings the couple, while his political views regarding English supremacy is hinted at in the relationship between the bride and groom themselves. Other critics have seen Spenser's gift to his bride not simply as a celebration of their wedding day, but a poetic argument for the kind of husband wife relationship he expects the two of them to have. Prothalamion is a song or a poem which is used for celebrating the forthcoming wedding. It is a 180-line poem. The poem begins with the poet himself and he is discontent. It is a culmination of the sonnets of Amorete. The poem begins with the description of River Thames. The poet uses the conventional symbol for quoting birds. The bird sings the mating tunes. These tunes are the part of the poet's wedding tunes. Prothalamion is written in the conventional form of a marriage song. The poem begins with a description of the River Thames, where Spenser finds two beautiful maidens. The poet proceeds to praise them and wishing them all the blessings for their marriages. The poem begins with a fine description of the day when on which he is writing the poem. Epithalamion is a poem written for the honor of the bride and bridegroom. It is classic in tradition and takes its settings and images from Ireland. It is a type of lyric poem called Spenserian sonnet. It has also a few references to the poet's own country and situation. It is also called epithalamy or epithalamium. It is sung at the marriage chamber. Prothalamion has theme called celebration around the river Thames. It is a key symbol and setting. Ideas of beauty along with images surround the theme. It has nymphs gathering flower crowns for the two sisters. It is called a nuptial song because it is Edmund Spenser's second wedding song. It is an example of Renaissance writing. He published his poem in the year 1596 in the celebration of his double marriage. Conversely, on comparison with the epithalamion, the verse is considered less realistic and unappealing. Spenser incorporates classical imagery strongly with a beautiful atmosphere in the poem. The emphasis of the Renaissance or prothalamion brings a tinge of mythological figures like Venus, Cynthia, and Titan. So, to summarize, here are some differences given between epithalamion and prothalamion. The word epithelium is derived from ancient Greece. On the other hand, the word prothalamion is derived from Greek roots. Epithalamion was first originated in year 1595. On the other hand, prothalamion was originated in the year 1596. Epithalamion highlights the personal nature of marital union. On the other hand, prothalamion addresses the social significance of marriage union. The personal approach of epithalamion is less. On the other hand, the personal approach in prothalamion is more. Both this poem use the theme of marriage. They highlight the personal nature of marriage union and choose the social significance of marriage upon the nobility. The reason why epithalamion is longer is that they elaborate the poem as it is not based on a personal approach. These poems have a year gap of 1 year, or as epithalamion was published in 1595 and prothalamion was published in year 1596. So that was the difference. Now we have question number third. Who were the pre-Raphaelites and what were the characteristics of the movement? Critically appreciate any one poem of his age or movement. An artistic movement founded in 1848 by the poet and painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the painters John Everett Millais and William Holman Hunt, who is often credited with the group's name, which indicates not a dismissal of the Italian painter Raphael but rejection of strict aesthetic adherence to the principle of composition and light characteristic of his style. The pre Raphaelites' commitment to sincerity, simplicity, and moral seriousness is evident in the contemplative but uncomplicated subject of its poetry and in the religious, mythical, and literary subjects depicted in his paintings. Christina Rossetti was both a close associate and critique of the group. Her poem Dreamland was published in the Brotherhood periodical The Germ, which ran a total of 4 issues in 1850. Her poem In the Artist's Studio offered a critique of pre-Raphaelites' treatment of their female subject, describing a painter who renders a woman not as she is but as she fills in history. Algernon Charles, Swinburne, and George Meredith were among the various authors associated with the group's members. While a relatively short lived movement, the pre Raphaelite Brotherhood had a profoundly influential effect on the course of Victorian literature and art. The pre Raphaelites were a loose and a baggy collective of Victorian poets, painters, illustrators, and designers whose tenure lasted from 1848 to roughly the turn of the century. Drawing inspiration from visual art and literature, their work privileged atmosphere and mood over narrative, focusing on medieval subjects, artistic introspection, female beauty, sexual yearning, and altered states of consciousness, in defiant opposition to the utilitarian ethos that formed the dominant ideology of the ninth century. The pre Raphaelites helped to popularize the notion of art and art for art's sake, generally devoid of the political edge that characterized much Victorian art and literature. Pre Raphaelite work nevertheless incorporated elements of 19th century realism in its attention to detail and its close observation of the natural world. Driven by Oscar Wilde, put it, three things the English public never forgets: youth, power, and enthusiasm. Pre Raphaelitism found itself paradoxically poised between nostalgia for the past and excitement about the future. 19th century disagreements over whether their art was forward thinking or retrogressive set a precedent for current critical debates about the extent to which their work should be considered avant garde. The Pre Raphaelite Brotherhood. Pre Raphaelitism began in 1848 when a group of 7 young artists banded together against what they felt was an artificial and mannered approach to painting taught at London's Royal Academy of Arts. They called themselves Pre Raphaelite Brotherhood a name that alluded to their preference for late medieval and early Renaissance art that came before Raphael. The painters the painters were Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, James Collinson, Frederick George Stephens. The non-painters were sculptor Thomas Wilner and Brotherhood secretary William Michael Rossetti, Dante Gabriel Rossetti's brother. Inspired by the work of old masters such as Van Eyck, Memling, Mantegna, Giotto, and Fra Angelico, and following a program of truth to nature, the artist advocated a return to the simplicity and contradictory, even paradoxical simplicity and sincerity of subject and style found in an earlier age. Their aims were vague and contradictory, even paradoxical, which was only to be expected from a youthful movement made up of strong minded individuals who sought to modernize art by reviving the practices of the Middle Ages. Characterized by flattened perspective, sharp outlines, bright colors, and close attention to detail that flouted classical conventions of symmetry, proportion, and carefully controlled chiaroscuro, early PRB paintings of religious subjects such as Hunt's A Converted British Family. Chiaroscuro, early PRB paintings of religious subjects such as Hunt's Christ in the house of his parent and Rossetti's Ec Ancilla Domini shocked critics with the hyperrealism perceived to be at odds with sacred events portrayed. The 1850 Royal Academy exhibition inaugurated what would remain an antagonistic relationship between establishment critics and the pre-Raphaelites. Critics were particularly dismayed at the hints of Tractorianism and Romishness they detected in the detailed ecclesiastic ecclesiastic symbolism of Millais' picture. They were further horrified by the painter's blasphemous depiction of the Christ child as a red headed member of an unidealized laboring class family. Both Hunt's and Millais' painting hinted at the breakdown of the social order, a worrying subject during a period where recent revolution in Europe threatened to spread to Britain. Literature was always as important as fine art to the pre-Raphaelites. Their paintings are often inspired by subjects from the Bible, medieval romances, Arthurian legends, Ovid, Chaucer, and Shakespeare. However, it is in their relationship to contemporary poetry that their avant-garde spirit is indisputably evident. In 1848, Rossetti and Holman Hunt drew up a list of immortals or artistic heroes, which included not only canonical writers such as Homer, Dante Alighieri, and Boccaccio, but also recent predecessors and contemporaries such as Byron, Keats, Shelley, Longfellow, Emerson, Poe, Tennyson, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Robert Browning, and Thackeray. Pre-Raphaelitism's second phase. Pre-Raphaelitism survived the Brotherhood dissolution in the early 1850s, resurfacing in 1857 when Oxford undergraduate William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones teamed up with Dante Gabriel Rossetti and painters Arthur Hughes, Valentine Prinsep, and others to decorate the Oxford Union Debating Chamber with Arthurian murals. In London, Burne-Jones, Rossetti, Ruskin, Prinsep, and painter Ford Madox Brown taught art classes at a working men college, a Christian socialist institution that sought to give working classmen access to liberal education. These adventures put the wine back in the sails of the pre-Raphaelite movement in 1861. Ford Madox Brown and architect Philip Webb joined Morris Burne-Jones and Rossetti in founding a decorative arts from which would become Morris and Co. As a protest against mass production in the industrial era, a firm's designers revived handcrafting and old techniques in order to emphasize the unique qualities and the beauty of natural materials, inaugurating the arts and crafts movement. Fourth question. What attitude to nature does Coleridge express in the Ode to Dejection? In what ways does this attitude differ from that of Wordsworth and from his own earlier attitude? Throughout his life, Coleridge was fascinated by the philosophical issue of relationship between the individual and nature. This issue was in fact related to several other philosophical issues, such as epistemology, the relationship between subject and object, the conflict between unity and diversity, and the concept of imagination that concerned Coleridge in his capacities as poet, philosopher, and theologian. Due to the vastness of these issues and the depth necessary for proper analysis of them, from sake of concision, the present discussion will be restricted to Coleridge's views on the individual nature relationship. In Dejection and Ode, Coleridge explores the duality between man and nature and how this relationship can fall apart and begin to create a divide. Using various academic resources such as published work and public work on Coleridge by established contemporary and modern critics, this essay will try to closely analyze Coleridge's own personal relationship with nature, the speaker's relationship with nature, and Coleridge's perception of humanity's relationship with nature. Several strands of argument will be presented in this essay. One is that within this poem, Coleridge is presenting the idea that in our life alone does nature live. This demonstrates the point that without humanity's capacity for imagination, nature lies passive and lifeless, just waiting to be brought to life by the poet. However, it will also be argued that Coleridge contradicts his own view of the relationship between nature and humanity, as by the end of Dejection and Ode, and several instances scattered throughout the poem, he is almost reconciled with nature and acknowledges that he was being given a unique imagination by nature that others do not have. It can also be argued that Coleridge seems to personify and be positive in regard to nature's role in humanity's well being and seems to imply nature has an active role in this also. It will also be argued from the viewpoint of several critics such as Modiano, Watson, Salinger, and Hill, who are also used within this essay to provide some contextual evidence and to support the analysis. All of these will be used to explain and support this disparity between Coleridge's views with Coleridge's feelings towards nature he expresses within the poem. It's quite important when discussing this issue to discuss Coleridge as a poet and how he often contradicted himself as shown in Dejection and Ode. Coleridge's prose writing, according to Modiano, has a vastly troubled history of conflicting attitudes and uncertain aspirations, meaning that Coleridge struggled consistently throughout his works to sustain one particular feeling or develop thought. It would explain the two conflicting sides of his argument in his poem, as perhaps he is often distracted and misled by the works of his peers. This could explain the reason behind the inconsistency in the portrayal of nature in Dejection and Ode, as at times nature is portrayed as being separate and distant from the speaker, despite the speaker reaching out and trying to connect with nature. The stifled, drowsy, uni-impassioned grief, which finds unimpassioned grief, which finds no natural outlet, no relief implies that nature in this instance is useless. His grief finds no natural outlet, and so nature has failed to evoke the feelings from him that it once did so easily to pull him back from his grief and stir his soul. In this way, he portrays nature as having turned her back on him, leaving him alone with no power of imagination. Instead of being one with nature, he no longer can find an outlet in nature and so is ostracized in this relationship. This could express Coleridge's doubts about the natural world's link to humanity of the time and himself as a human being. Nature cannot speak back to him, it cannot reach out to him, so he feels alienated. This poem could also be seen as a warning from a Coleridge himself, speaking firsthand about the dangers of falling into the trap of reason and logic, and the human need to analyze, leading us down a path far from our natural being. An alternative view into Coleridge's intent in writing Dejection and Ode is offered by Salinger, who supports the idea that Coleridge held two different theories about poetic creation. According to the first, it springs from self identification with nature. For the second, it is a product of autonomous will. This can be inferred to mean that Coleridge believed two quite different things about nature and the imagination simultaneously. That they were separate ideas is questionable, as the two seem to come together into one. Evidence of this conflict in those two theories can be seen within dejection and on when Coleridge explains that suspends what nature gave me at my birth, my shaping spirit of imagination. Nature has bestowed her gifts upon him. He was favored with the spirit of imagination, which has shaped his whole direction in life as a poet. It is this imagination that the earlier claim evokes nature into a living being, and yet, if nature gave him his ability, perhaps Coleridge is implying that nature is already a living being. This then directly contradicts the early inference, as nature is shown here not to have abandoned him despite her bestowing him with gifts. He becomes ambivalent to his own capabilities. He then becomes simply the distant and unaffected one in the question number 5. What was the Reformation? What relations can you identify and trace between the Renaissance and the Reformation? By 1530, over 10,000 publications are known with a total of 10 million copies. The Reformation was thus a media revolution. Luther strengthened his attacks on Rome by depicting a good against bad church. From there, it became clear that print could be used for propaganda in the Reformation for particular agendas, although the term propaganda derives from the Catholic Congeratio de Propaganda Fide, congregation for propagating the faith. From the Counter Reformation, Reform writers used existing. The Reformation, alternatively named as Protestant Reformation or the European Reformation, was a major movement within Western Christianity in 16th century Europe that posed a religious and political challenge to a Catholic Church and in particular to papal authority, arising from what were perceived to be the errors, abuses, and discrepancies by the Catholic Church. The Reformation Protestantism and the split of Western Church into Protestantism and what is now the Roman Catholic Church. It is also considered to be one of the events that signify the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period in Europe. The Protestant Reformation, a religious movement that began in the 16th century, brought an end to the ecclesiastical unity of medieval Christianity in Western Europe and profoundly reshaped the course of modern history. Sometimes called the Protestant Revolution, the Reformation appealed to the founders of the US and some of its concepts of individualism and free expression of religion are incorporated into the First Amendment. The Reformation was a triumph of literacy and the new printing press. Luther's translation of the Bible into German was a decisive moment in the spread of literacy and stimulated as well as the printing and distribution of religious books and pamphlets. From 1517 onward, religious pamphlets flooded Germany and much of Europe, styles, cliches, and stereotypes which they adapted as needed. Especially effective were writings in German, including Luther's translation of the Bible, his smaller catechism from parents teaching their children, and his larger catechism for pastors. Renaissance encouraged people to sail to other countries for trading purposes, and these people carried with them the Reformed Christianity, the world's civilization, liberalization, economic process, and development in trade all advanced forward simultaneously. Man was released from darkness, unreasonability by the Renaissance. He was again freed from religious orthodoxy reformation. The two pronged attack, launched by using the German vernacular, they expressed the Apostles' Creed in simpler, more personal, Trinitarian language. Illustrations in the German Bible and in many tracts popularized Luther's idea. Lucas Cranach, the elder, the great printer patronized by the electors of Wittenberg, was a close friend of Luther, and he illustrated Luther's theology for a popular audience. He dramatized Luther's views on the relationship between the Old and New Testaments while remaining mindful of Luther's careful distinction about proper and improper uses of visual imagery. Relation between Renaissance and Reformation. Renaissance helped Reformation in other ways also. The international relation and the trade increased as a result of Renaissance. People of different parts of the globe came in close contact with to broaden their mind and outlook. Renaissance prepared the field for the rise and development of nationality and reasonability in their mind. They refused to be guided by orthodox religion and dictates of church. Simultaneously, the Reformation movement removed the unreligious stigma from the body of Christianity. The liberal aspects of Christianity received wide support from the people of other countries. Renaissance and Reformation created a new world, a world of liberalism, a world of free thought and free trade. The key difference between Renaissance and Reformation is that Renaissance was a cultural movement that began in Italy and spread across Europe, while Reformation was a Northern European Christian movement. Renaissance paved the way for the advancement in art and architecture, while Reformation paved the way for religious fragmentation, establishing Protestantism. Another difference between Renaissance and Reformation is that the former started in Florence and ended spreading in different parts of Europe, whereas the latter spread only in Northern Europe. Southern Europe remained Catholic. One of the distinguishing features of Renaissance art was the delineation of linear perspective in its art pieces. On the other hand, the religious Reformation movement showed doctrinal differences among the reformers that led to the factions such as Puritans and Lutheran, the Presbyterian, and the Reformed. Renaissance was a cultural movement that began in Italy and spread across Europe, while Reformation was a Northern Europe Christian movement. Renaissance paved the way for the advancement in art and agriculture, whereas Reformation paved the way for the religious fragmentation. This is the key difference between Renaissance and Reformation. So, this was our assignment. We will be back with more Ignou assignments. Till then, stay tuned. Thank you.